Hi, it's Elle here at Awakening Cosmic Reality Show, and I have Mary Rodwell here with me today. She was a nurse and then transitioned to counseling and hypnosis work. Welcome, Mary.
Thank you, Elaine. It's an absolute pleasure.
I'm so glad you can come on the show.
Well, it's always wonderful to be asked. And as I was saying to you just before we began, that for me, it's a very much important part of my work is to explain my research and to explain why I've got involved in this, and as a way of helping people understand themselves and their experiences.
Can you please tell us what inspired you to become a counselor and work with hypnosis with people?
Well, the story is that I started out as a nurse and then I was a midwife for a while. And then when I had my children, I was invited to learn counseling in a medical practice. And then I got exposed to all sorts of experiences, you know, people going through grief issues, family problems, you know, some forms of various types of illness, etc. What it did show me through doing counseling was that stress and emotional problems often cause disease. So it was, to me, a better way of, you know, helping people was to do prevention rather than cure in that sense. However, when I came to Australia, I went into also grief and bereavement, hospice, people facing their mortality. And from that, there were a lot of what I call unusual multi-dimensional experiences people had. You know, they'd sense maybe mum was around, or they would sense a family member was communicating with them, or they would sense energies or spirits. And this is something that's been very much part of my interest all my life, is the mystery. You know, who are we? What are we? What does it all mean? What's life all about? All the big questions have always been very much a focus of mine. But from doing counseling, I was very aware, and certainly from my spiritual beliefs expanded into, there's no question that we survive as a consciousness after death. And I got very interested in reincarnation and learned hypnosis and started to do past life work, which I found fascinating, because we know that you don't necessarily have to believe you've got a past life to experience it. You've just got to be open to the process. And that's very convincing for me, because I wanted to be sure that that was valid. And so after many, many regressions where people were going back into other lifetimes, experiencing them having the emotional content, I was fascinated in the whole business of, is it just this planet, or is it other planets as well? But the crucial thing for me was when someone came through the door saying, Mary, I've heard you're open-minded. For this, there's no support groups. For this, they just think you're crazy. And proceeded to tell me about his experiences on board spacecraft, waking up with marks on his body. His partner was having experiences. The children were having experiences. People, his relatives wouldn't come to the house because they thought it was demons. And he said, can you help? And that was really the start of me going down what I call the extraterrestrial rabbit hole. Because there was no doubt in my mind that this was a reality with this. He was very articulate, very grounded. It wasn't like he, you know, they call them the space cadets. There was nothing space cadet about it. It was just, this is what's going on. You know, and it wasn't just him. It was his whole family involved. And that intrigued me as well. So basically, I was very fortunate. I'd read a couple of books about this prior to him walking through the door. And one of them was by Dr. John Mack, Abduction, Human Encounters with Aliens. And he was professor of psychiatry at Harvard University. So there's a very credible baseline. And the second one was Communion by Whitley Strieber, who of course has written many books on his experiences as well. So I'd read about this, never expecting that I would meet anyone who'd had experiences. So when someone walked through his door, I was fascinated and intrigued. Interestingly, Dr. John Mack was very clear that in the end, even though he'd come in as a skeptic, he really believed at the end of the day this was real. And he wrote another book, Passport to the Cosmos, about going into hypnosis, then remembering things on board spacecraft, etc., etc. And for me, that was my baseline. So what was fascinating is within a few weeks of this gentleman walking through the door, 2 weeks later, someone else walked through the door having similar kinds of experiences. And then I suppose the rest is history. 3,500 people later, families and children as well. I have absolutely no doubts this is real, and that we as a public are not being told the truth about this reality.
So have you noticed, do clients often come in with some conscious memories that they've had of their experiences, and through the hypnosis they'd like to know more to gain clarity of what happened to them?
Absolutely, Lena, that's very common that people do have. They call them dreams sometimes because they'll say, I dreamt I was on a spacecraft or whatever. Often these so-called dreams are not dreams. All it means is they're in a trance state when they're going on board craft. So they think it's a dream. But as I say to them, a dream is something that you forget usually within minutes or seconds or minutes of waking up, whereas these stay with you for years. If that's the case, then it's not a dream. They will also have, many will say, well, I saw a spacecraft once when I was a kid, or my dad always believed in UFOs. There is what I call the intergenerational link, because often there is one, that if someone has an experience, then either mum or dad or grandparents have been interested in UFOs, or very psychic or very intuitive. And there's your intergenerational link. So they will have something. They may have missing time, and that's a very common one, where they say, look, you know, a few years ago I was seeing some strange lights. I was on my way to see Auntie Jane, and I was 2 hours late, and I still don't know why I was 2 hours late. And then usually in hypnosis we will revisit that, and we usually find it's a pickup, that someone's had an experience where they've gone on board craft. They may have a medical exam, so, you know, genetic material taken, a healing procedure, a whole range of things can happen. But the interesting thing with this, Lena, is that what I've discovered is often in that hypnosis, they will discover that they've been picked up numerous times, that it wasn't just that one time, often from being a small child or even a baby. So this is often, more often as not, seems to be a lifelong thing rather than just the occasional pickup, and that's all they'll experience.
And from watching your New Humans lecture, and also from 2010 on YouTube recently, I saw that your hypnosis method is quite different from others. And can you maybe describe a little bit what your process is?
You're quite correct. One of the things that I discovered is there are different levels to work on with hypnosis, and that doesn't just depend on the individual in that trance state. I mean, they can be in a actually light trance. It doesn't have to be somnambulistic, which only about 20% of people go completely unconscious and don't remember anything. Most will remember their hypnosis, if not everything in it, but certainly a fair bit, and can be in very light trance, in fact, to explore this. But with the hypnotherapist, there are many that stay purely distant and just a facilitator of the person's process. But what I've discovered is with many intuitive hypnotherapists, that they actually will go on a similar frequency to the individual having the experience, and they will start to get information too. And part of my work has been shown experienced hypnotherapists how to open themselves up to being more intuitive with their work, because when you do that, you will find that you will get a far clearer sense of how to guide them rather than following a particular path. You'll get a sense of what is going to be the most helpful, and it may be that, you know, you're tuning into your own intuition, to your own source of if you like, guidance. But the great thing with that is then you are working in a way of intent to expand as much as possible the individual's information and understanding of their experiences. And that just means that the facilitator understands also that many of those that come, particularly with encounters, are already opening up multidimensionally. They're already having a certain feeling or knowing or sensing. They may be clairvoyant, clairaudient. They may be aware they're surrounded by spirits or energies or non-human intelligences. If you don't understand that only academically, it's much harder for you to support their, if you like, their evolving into this higher awareness if you don't know what it feels like. Mm-hmm. So part of my work, and I call it MIST, which is multi-dimensional information in a superconscious trance state, means that the facilitator is going on a similar frequency. And so they know and can sense what a lot more of what's going on, so they can maximize that session so that it is the most useful, not just on a conscious, not just on a subconscious, but a superconscious level. And that I found with this particular experience has been really useful, because then you can really make that session as, because you're asking for that superconscious to guide the whole session, you are actually maximizing what that individual can learn and understand from that particular session.
And I've heard that the non-human intelligences could be different extraterrestrials that make ET contact or abduction experiences. And there's also the MyLab's military abductions. What's the differences between those two, and how can you tell them apart?
Very good question. And one of the things that a lot of the public are not aware of is how much the military know about this whole scenario of us being visited. And they've known for many, many years that we're being visited by numerous different intelligences. And it's because of that that anyone who's having encounters or whatever, they're very interested in, because they want to find out what's happening on board craft. What is the person experiencing? What are they being taught? What are they being shown? What do they know about the beings they're interacting with? Because that's all data that they want to understand, to know, well, what's the agendas, what's going on. So my lab, which is military abductions, and they have the technology to do it, is if you are having experiences with any of these visitors, then they can pick you up and abduct you, and you'll be interrogated. They will use drugs, they use trauma to get as much information out of you as possible, and in a way that you will never be believed. Even if you work out that it's not the real extraterrestrial encounter. One of the things when I've done experiencer groups, where I found the ones that have always been the most traumatized have been the ones that have had MyLab abductions, not the extraterrestrial ones. There is a distinct difference in many cases of the trauma they experience from that, far more so in terms of my research, than those that have had purely extraterrestrial experiences. And there are key indicators as well. They may see humans in lab coats, they may see grey beings or even reptilian beings, but what people don't realize is that sometimes those are programmed life forms created by the military. They are not necessarily the real deal, but they may believe them to be so. So it's a very, very complex thing to isolate. Is this one or both? And for most of these that are having MyLab, yes, they've had very real extraterrestrial ones, but it can be mixed up with the MyLab.
What does the frequency feel like when it's the extraterrestrials making the contact or doing the abductions?
Many eventually work out what is the true extraterrestrial experience against what the MyLab is. It's completely different frequency. And the wonderful thing with those that I've worked with is that they get a real sense when they trust it, when they trust what their resonance is to what is coming from one rather than another. And part of my work is to encourage that resonance to their truth. To, you know, when people say to me, well, I'm scared because somebody told me these ones are bad and these ones are good. What, you know, who are the goodies and who are the baddies, kind of thing. And I say, it's really important you trust yourself rather than trust other people's experiences, because they're coming from their own lens and the way that they want to interpret things. For example, you know, people will say, well, are the greys all bad, or etc. And I say, well, I've been told by one lady that she knew of 165 species of grey. So you can't just say, well, all greys are bad. I say to people when they're having experiences, what are you feeling from that being? What's your sense? Does it feel loving? Does it feel accepting? Or does it feel threatening? Does it feel, because that's the only thing that we've got to actually work out, you know, what is positive or not positive. And I mean, we do it in everyday life, don't we? You know, I always say to people, when someone comes to your front door, what is it in you that invites some people in for a cup of tea and somebody else you're pretty happy to keep the other side of the door? That's exactly the same thing. It's just trusting that resonance.
Mm-hmm. And when you do the past lives, when clients actually see past lives, what does that look like or feel like in your experience to them or to you?
The past life is really an interesting one. And usually someone comes to me, occasionally it's just curiosity. For most people, it's because they may have a phobia, for example. They may have something that they feel they can't explain. So what we're doing is we're exploring the life that's relevant to that possible imprint, if you like, or that phobia that they may have, whether it's a phobia of water or something. Where did it come from, so that we can actually clear it energetically? And that can be done very effectively. And I've had some amazing results from someone going back to a lifetime that had a phobia of a particular thing, whether it's heights or something. And they've actually discovered where it came from. And I know that you do this as well. What is great then is, okay, is this something we can clear now? And you work with them energetically to clear whatever that may be the basis of that particular phobia. And the wonderful thing at the end of it is that it in many cases it clears that phobia. So for me, the evidence is the result, and the result can be quite incredible by just going back and releasing that particular energetic imprint. So past life can be a very valuable one. But what I also like to do is take them to the death sequence, because I want them to see how that they are still conscious beings after the death sequence, that they're not attached to that meat body, and that they are moving into the spiritual realm. And I will often say to them, so what did you learn in that life? And they may say, oh, I learned about compassion, or I learned about limits, or I learned about whatever. It gives them a whole new picture of themselves and their consciousness, their essence, including, as you know, sometimes they'll tell you about deciding about their present life and picking mum and dad, who they're going to have as mum and dad from their soul family, brothers and sisters, to teach them various things in this life. And the thing that's led me to understand is when people say, oh, you know, this and this and this has happened. What I'm saying to them is, the orchestrator of your journey, from my research, is you. Your consciousness has been the one that's orchestrated your human journey, all the challenges that you experience and what have you. And when people say, well, where's the free will? I say the free will is your attitude to it. Do you want to see it as a victim, or do you want to see it as a silver lining to teach you and help you to grow? So all my work, and I sense from what you're saying about yourself, is really goes back to the soul journey, because to me, everything that we're talking about really is about that. It's about the essence that we are, the consciousness that we are.
Yes, I've met some experiencers who've told me, well, I don't feel comfortable on this planet. I don't feel like I'm from here. Where am I from? I want to explore my past lives and get a timeline and see that. Have you had clients like that who've like asked to see their past lives and figure out who they were as ETs or ET hybrids before?
Many have gone into other lifetimes where they're not human, and on other planets, other universes, other dimensions, parallel universes, different timelines, etc. So my sense of reality now has expanded extraordinarily through working with hundreds of people. And the interesting thing is, With children, though, many of them have conscious recall of other lifetimes. You know, when I've talked to some of them, where they'll say that what planet they came from, whether they were blue being, remembering even as a spirit choosing their life here, and remembering actually going into mummy's tummy, as they would say, and choosing mummy's tummy. One recently told me this was his first Earth life, and that he'd come to deal with the pollution on this planet. That was part of his mission. So the children that I write about, for them, it's conscious memory. It isn't something that I've needed to do hypnosis with. And that is even with some of the teenagers that are being born, you know, that have been born in recent years. They'll tell me the same thing. They will remember many lifetimes. You know, one young man telling me about his life on Mars, what he did, and he used to build intergalactic craft on Mars and the wars on Mars, and went into extraordinary detail. And none of this, as I say, is hypnosis. This is conscious recall. In fact, one of the young ladies I talk about, Lee Capitelli, who remembers lives on a life here at Atlantis when she was a programmer of a crystal skull, and remembers Atlantis going down and the actual time it went down and what happened to her bird, who got very agitated at the time, in great detail. She also talked about life on other planets, one where she's a purple being, Izoni. But she's even written a book now about some of her past lives and what she remembers of them. So some of the new generations are really very aware, with adults that maybe haven't got total recall. When you take them into hypnosis, as you will know, and that's the question, that's the focus, then it comes in, and they may have been just pure energy. They may be a crystalline being, a feline being, they may be a mantis being, they may be, there's an extraordinary amount of different types of consciousness or forms, and some of them are interdimensional, extra-dimensional, trans-dimensional, some connect to angelic beings, for example, dragon beings. So the range is huge, and it really exposes, and has done for me, exposes our potentials in terms of a soul and what forms we take to learn and grow to understand different realities.
Do the new humans often come in with abilities like psychic abilities, healing? Have you noticed that?
That's something I've talked about and I've written about in The New Human particularly, although I did write about it a bit in Awakening, because as people wake up to their experiences and become comfortable with them, they notice that their multidimensional awareness expands. So they start to become more clairvoyant, clairaudient, clairsentient. They may see future events, for example. They may find they've got healing abilities as well. They will sense orbs, or they'll sense energy fields, or they'll start to see spirits, or start to see ETs, and whatever. So those senses expand, and I talk about how you manage that in Awakening. But in The New Human, what's interesting with the children is that they seem to be born and with this and operate more naturally with it, because I believe the adults have been shut down often with those, you know, they've had them as a child, but they've been shut down, told it's not real, you know, it's your imagination. So many of them have been shut down through education, or their parents saying it's not okay or whatever. And it's not till later they start to open up again, where the same thing's happening with the children now, although it's harder to shut them down than because they will manifest them so overtly. And I mean, I've met children that have told me they've communicated with the elements, that they will see energy fields, that they know how to heal. As one 8-year-old told me that she gets taken to a planet where she's shown how to levitate and how to use her third eye, for example, as well as being shown genetic engineering by different species, by the beings, for example. So there's a whole range of things these children say they can do, because they're being taught this on board the spacecraft. They're being taught how to use their abilities. They're being taught about everything to do with how to manage entities, how to manage your communication with these intelligences. They're taught cosmology. They're taught the the real origin of our species. They're taught their role and how they can manage to do their mission. So there's I call it, you know, the cosmic space school, because this is what a lot of the children are experiencing on board craft.
Are adults also taken sometimes to these cosmic schools or light schools?
Absolutely. And interestingly, many years ago, one of Whitley Strieber's books was called The Secret School, where he recalls being going out at night and being taught when I think he's 8 or 9 years old. And I know at the time he got a lot of problems with people struggling with the fact that he was being helped to understand. And he explains in the book how he was being shown his past lives, but he was seeing them all operating at the same time, almost like there was no past or future, but it was all now. And he was actually having those experiences. He was able to see his lifetimes in an earlier time in Europe, I think it was, but all at the same time he was having that experience. So we're told that time is a linear concept, but it in fact doesn't operate when you're multidimensional.
Do some of your clients often say that they communicate in light language, write in it, sing in it, heal in it? And how does that work?
It's part of the expressions of contact that I've written about many, many times. When people say to me, where's the evidence that people are having experiences? I think they expect them to come back with a bit of spacecraft. I say to them, the evidence is in the person that is completely changed through their experiences. For example, they will go from perhaps very materialistic 3D focus to losing all interest in materialism, wanting to live holistic rural lifestyles often, very caring about everything, believing it is all now consciousness. One gentleman said, after my experiences, I wouldn't even step on an ant. But what also is manifesting through their contact and through their experiences is what I call these expressions, these creative expressions. They may start writing unusual scripts, come out with what we call star languages or light language or universal languages. They may start doing certain kinds of artwork, not only of the beings and the craft, but other unusual geometric artwork, which they say triggers perception. They may start manifesting different kinds of music, which is downloaded from these beings, which have the frequencies. So lots of creative expressions come, and some of them have never been taught how to pick up a paintbrush. Will suddenly start doing it. One of the musicians that I mentioned a few times in my presentations is Juliana Uka, who's a wonderful celebrated violinist. She also does this incredible artwork, and she was never taught how to paint. But she does this most beautiful artwork, for example. And somebody else recently, a gentleman who does life between lives hypnosis, Peter Smith, who's has taken on after Dr. Michael Newton and his book's Journey of Souls, which is exploring in between lives. We spent some time together at a UFO Congress, and he saw my presentation, and he said when he went home, he didn't know whether it was the presentation or not, but suspected it was, that he suddenly started to do this unusual artwork. He's never picked up a paintbrush in his life before, and was doing artwork very similar to the Aborigines. And he said, and after I read the book, The New Human, that actually accelerated what he was doing. And he said, and I don't know why I'm drawn to doing it now, but something happened after he'd seen some of this artwork, and heard some of the languages, and seen some of the scripts. There's a coding, there's a frequency in that is activating what I call, human consciousness without question. Many people find they're changing. I remember one who was a nurse listening to my presentation, and immediately after the presentation, she was writing script and came up and said to me, look what I've just found myself doing, Mary. I don't know why I'm doing it, but suddenly I found myself doing this. This is, to me, the most profound part of contact, because what it's showing is that people change in a huge accelerated way. And it's always been the fact that I want to say here is that what we discovered in our surveys with the Dr. Edgar Mitchell Free Foundation, where we surveyed 4,200 people, 600 questions. And one of the questions was at the end of it, you know, where are you? What do you see has been the most important change? And they said 85% said they'd had a psycho-spiritual transformation. Only 15% remained in the fear with it. The rest said they would never have changed what had happened, even though they started out being really fearful. They worked through that process into understanding more of who they were and who was interacting with them in a very positive way. And that's never been known before. No one's done such a survey of such complexity ever. And that is one of the outcomes. There's many other fascinating outcomes, but that's the one, and that's in Beyond UFOs.
Have you ever had clients that during hypnosis get downloads of information like medical stuff, technology, and that's applicable somehow in their lives? They can actually use it for something. Have you ever had that happen?
It's a good question. And yes, many get downloads of a whole range of things, from quantum physics right through to the origin of the species, right through to healing technologies, free energy. Sometimes they can utilize it in their job, for example. I've met a number of medical doctors that have been given information about healing and this kind of thing. So they've moved sideways into more complementary alternative understanding of how to work with the body. I know several PhDs that now work with crystals, for example, because they've discovered that there's a frequency with crystals that can help with healing, for example. So it's been quite interesting that if they're in a field, but they have to, the difficulty many of them have that are in with these professions is they have to be very careful, because if they become too unusual or too alternative, then they get a hard time by their own colleagues. And I know several of them saying, I can't tell my colleagues about what I sense about things now and what I know about things, because you know, they wouldn't understand. They will just think I'm crazy. And this brings me into the whole problem we have with mainstream consensus thinking, is we still have a psychology that won't allow you to be multidimensional. It's quite fine as long as it's through your senses, your 5 senses, but don't, for goodness sake, say that you're more than your 5 senses, that you're getting messages or you're having an interaction with something that's non-physical, or you're seeing something beyond the 1% visual spectrum, or if you are having any kind of multi-dimensional experience and you go to see most conventional psychiatrists or psychologists, the outcome isn't necessarily going to be very helpful to you. And you know what I'm talking about. And this is the problem, because it's seen as an aberration. It's seen as a mental dysfunction. We need to medicate you and dumb you down, because that is the way it's still being interpreted by mainstream. And this is the big issue I have, to be honest, Elena, because coming from a therapeutic healing perspective, this horrifies me that people that are opening up multidimensionally, which is our natural state, that's what we're meant, this is who we are. We are not just third dimensional. We're not, you know, we're not just, that's not just our reality. We've actually got a multidimensional consciousness that accesses the quantum field. And what we're not being allowed to do is access it and given any support with that. So you get many people that start to open up. They may be frightened, they're trying to understand it, and they know that consensus is that, well, you're going crazy, aren't you, if you're hearing voices, or you're going crazy if you're having downloads, or you're going crazy because you're starting to see things that other people don't see. And if they go and get help when they're trying to understand it, to someone who doesn't understand, then it is immediately going to be medication or hospital or whatever. And I have met hundreds that have had that experience. And that is why I'm so passionate about changing this consensus model. Because, you know, I meet clinical psychologists that have encounters. I meet psychiatrists that have had encounters, but can they talk about it? No, they can't talk to their colleagues whatsoever. And that is the nonsense, if you like. You know, people are seeing the elephant, but no one's allowed to say, I see the elephant. Because if you do, immediately, then you're put in that basket that are one of the crazy ones, you know, or whatever. When in fact, they're the ones that are the most awake. And the ones that are actually what I call shut down is those that are afraid to open up to their multidimensional awareness. We all have intuition. We all have sensing knowings. We all have, you know, these abilities, but we sometimes listen. Sometimes we're afraid if we do that we're going to go crazy, when in fact they are a natural part of who we are.
There could be like missed opportunities if you don't listen to that intuition, that guidance within.
Absolutely, because it's usually 100% right. Whereas our logic analytical side can make a lot of mistakes. We're meant, I believe, we're meant to work in concert with our 3D reality, but our multidimensional reality actually in harmony, not just with one or the other, but both, but in harmony rather than, you know, this kind of separating out. So a lot of my work is helping people to ground and anchor that so that they can operate with confidence with their multidimensional self. Once they understand it, they're not afraid of it, they can use it, it's empowering, and it is part of our, you know, it's who we are as human beings. We are this consciousness, we are spirit within a body, not the other way around.
Have you ever had anybody ask, like, clients to meet their higher selves and learn to communicate with their higher self? How does that work?
It's a good one. And as a hypnotherapist, you know, if you want to work with the quantum field, you're pulling in that superconscious higher self, whatever name you want to give that wise part of you, I call it, you know, that super wise part of you. And people can access that through hypnosis. You can call on it, but you can also do it through meditation. Is it that once you have that intent, you're putting out the frequency that's saying, I want to communicate with that wise part of me. And, you know, we call it our inner wisdom. We go into meditation and we want to talk to that inner wisdom. We can access it like that very easily. Others may access that through a trance state, whether or not it's through somebody doing hypnosis or a shamanic way of accessing the higher self. Some will use something like ayahuasca or whatever. They do that in many countries as a way of accessing their superconscious and the quantum reality, so that they can actually start gaining information from all those levels of our multidimensional selves.
Have you ever had somebody ask for a request to go into their future and see their future lives, their future in hypnosis?
Yes, I have, but not very often. The concern around that is that depending on choices depends whether or not we'll be on one timeline or another timeline. And that's something that I've come to understand. There can be different timelines depending on choices that we make right now. So that may be one possible future, but it may not be the one that you ultimately choose. So it can be useful as a curiosity, I think, but ultimately, I think for me anyway, part of the fun of having this human adventure is not knowing what the future is, that we see it and we experience it unfolding. It's like, I always think it's like reading the end of the book before you've read the story. I think that spoils it, because then you just don't want to read it, do you? Because you already know what the end is going to be. So for me, I think for most people, you can't be absolutely certain, even if you do that it's the timeline that you'll ultimately choose.
Because I've had weird requests. People want to see their future timeline, what they're doing in the future. So I always say the future can change. What you're seeing is something that could happen, or it could change and it will happen differently. But the essence of what you saw might be there in some way.
Yeah, I think that fits in with how I've come to understand it, because, you know, now I know a little bit more about different timelines. A lot is about your choices, which timeline you ultimately end on. So curiosity wise, it would be interesting, I think. But, you know, personally, I'm enjoying seeing how it unfolds, because then it keeps me interested. I think I'd be really bored if I really knew what was the end of my life. In fact, I don't really want to know, thanks very much.
And time isn't linear, right?
That's right.
It flows and it floats, so it can change quickly.
Okay, yes.
Have parents of gifted children who have autism come to you and asked, why does my child have this? How can I help them? They're so expressive. They can talk about extraterrestrials, what they see, what they can paint beautiful pictures, but they're autistic. Like, have they come to you for help and balance? How does that work?
Well, it's a good question. And it was one that when I started out, I never expected to even find this as part of this whole phenomena. How it started out was, I realized that this was an intergenerational experience, that it was coming down the family lines. And I got more and more parents saying to me who'd had experiences that one or more of their children might be ADHD, Asperger's, dyslexic, etc. And I was thinking, because it was obvious to me there's a kind of upgrade going on with each generation of consciousness, as we're being prepared to be more and more part of this expanded consciousness of humanity. Why then are the ETs doing this? You know, giving us ADHD children and, you know, Asperger's, etc. Because it didn't make sense. I was speaking with one gentleman who lives in Hong Kong, who's in his middle years now, and wrote the book Close Encounters of the ADHD Kind, Neil Gold. And what he said to me was, even as a child, he didn't know he was ADHD till he was in his middle years. He said, I always saw reality in a more complex way than most people. And he said, for him, that's what ADHD is. It is an expanded consciousness. And he retranslated his ADHD as always dialed into higher dimensions. Because ADHD, I believe, is a different wiring of human. And that is why they're harder to program into 3D, because that's the reason they're harder to program. The less we are completely controlled by our 3D programming, the more we can expand. It's our 3D programming that stops us from owning much of our experiences. Whereas ADHD, the only way you can program them is to slow them down, because they're operating in a higher frequency. So that was just one. But then I talked to Asperger's, and many of them are highly intelligent. And what's interesting with them, they often have higher sensitivities too, seeing a broader spectrum of light. They may sense things, see things, all the rest of it, as the ADHDs do. And some of the dyslexics, I found that they're all very much more expanded in their abilities. So looking at that and seeing time and time again, someone with experiences and their child, another ADHD, another dyslexic, I kept seeing the patterns time and time and time again. So without question, it was linked. So then what do we do to help them? And I worked with a molecular biologist, Dr. Lena Olson, who herself, she calls them letter people, the ADHDs and whatever. She was one with autism as well and dyslexia, and said what they need is more of certain vitamins, like vitamin B stabilizes them, and other ones. And in my book, The New Human, I devote several chapters to the way you can stabilize the ADHDs and all of those letter people, because she found a way as a scientist. She said, for example, their sense of touch is, the senses of touch is far more expanded. Hearing, they can hear a broader spectrum of hearing. Sight, everything's expanded in their senses as well. So they're hypersensitive, many of them. We need to know how to balance that out and understand it, rather than say, well, there's something wrong with them. No, they're not. They're actually the new human. They're where we're going. The older models, we just need to be woken up a little bit more. So they're the new model of human. Homo noeticus, as one young lady described from 2000, they're the Homo noeticus. They're the ones that are going to help us with our future, help us understand who we are and what we are. With this expanded sense, they are aware of being visited by non-human intelligences. They're aware of spirit guides. They're aware of energy fields. They're aware of their abilities. And this is what I found fascinating, and I wrote about it, is when they talk about what they're being taught on spacecraft, what they're being shown on spacecraft. One 8-year-old explained to me that when he's up on the spacecraft with a couple of his school friends, there's other children around, but they're not always quite human. He said they looked a bit different, and teaching and being taught complex things to use their consciousness with their mind. And I remember him saying, so what kinds of things are you being taught? And he told me it was too complex for me to understand. So that put me in my place pretty well. But the bottom line is, with all of that, is this is what we are now bringing into the planet. These are new heightened awareness humans. And they're also showing us that we can join them. It's not like we're being left behind as the older models. What's happening for the older models is we're being activated as well, so that we can be just as aware, just as sensitive, just as informed as the children. It's that their frequency is helping us to do that.
Are these activations in our own DNA, for example, in the genome? How does that work?
Well, it's a good question, and it's something that I've looked into a lot as a former nurse and midwife. Is, so where is this? How can we look at this in a tangible way? One of the things that I explored was the DNA, and being fully aware that there was a point in our history, and we were told about this, that we had Neanderthals, Cro-Magnon, then there was this missing link, and suddenly Homo sapiens sapiens was born with twice the brain size, for example. What was going, how did that happen? Then we look at the gods, and the gods that have been visiting us all through history. And we ask the question, were they really gods, or were they just technically advanced extraterrestrials visiting this planet? And there is so much evidence now in pictures, drawings, art, you know, all sorts of artwork, that craft were visiting this planet with these different types of beings all through our history. Many of the indigenous tribes talk about these gods creating humans. The Dogon tribe talks about that, that we were created by them, and others. And the real consensus, and it's very complex to go into it, yeah, and I won't go into it in detail, but the sense is that maybe at least 12 different species of non-human intelligence have added their DNA to ours. So what has been brought up by Dr. Francis Crick, who was co-founder of the DNA molecule, was he also talked about us being an intelligent design, Homo sapiens sapiens. And with that is that we have this DNA from them, and that at a certain point in our evolution, we will become aware of it. And I think my understanding is what he may mean by that is, first of all, we have actually seen, and there have been geneticists that have seen that where we've been spliced and put back together again, and know, and have said that we've been a designed species. But we also have 223 genes in our DNA that were a sideways insertion of genetic material, all to do with higher psychological functioning. Where did that come from? So these anomalies, these really can only, to me, make one very clear conclusion that we are a designed species, very likely designed by a number of intelligences. And what's happening is that the scientists have seen dormant, what they call dormant DNA or junk DNA. They don't know what it's there for. My suspicion is that that is our DNA from these intelligences, and at a certain point, that will be activated. And that's what many of those healers talk about now, is activating that part of our DNA. And people are starting, as it gets activated, start to say, you know, I feel connected to the Pleiades, or I'm connected to Orion, or I'm connected to Sirius. Why are they saying that? Unless part of that DNA of that particular species is being activated in them in some way. And I think that's what's going on.
I agree with you, because I often I've had parents say to me, my kids are really psychic. I don't know where it comes from. I have intuition, but I don't have this sense of psychicness. Like, how do I connect with my child? Have you ever had that happen?
It's actually very common, because I suppose I'm fortunate now that the more people know about my work, the more the parents will contact me and say, my child's been telling me about what happens on the spacecraft, that they go to Mars sometimes and that they come from another planet. They'll talk about the family. They don't like it down here very much. It's really hard being human, and they don't really feel like they belong. All these kinds of things. But then they will also tell them about things to do with the DNA, or things to do with the intelligences they're connecting to, their special friends, the information that they're given, all this. And the parents are saying, where does it come from? I've never mentioned any of this. I've never talked about this. I don't know even how to respond, especially when you get children speaking the star languages completely spontaneously. And I've got recordings, only recently a mother sent me a recording of a 5-year-old girl that says she's come to make an impact on this planet and is speaking one of these star languages. And she sent me the recording of it. Another 8-year-old speaking a star language. I remember several months ago, a mother writing to me and saying her son speaks to her in a star language. He's all of 9. She responds in a star language, but he knows what he's saying and she doesn't. So where is this all coming from? It's coming from an awareness, a new consciousness that's part of who we are now as a species, where I feel we're shifting, we're evolving into more of our connection to our cosmic heritage.
And could this also be familial lineage, where somebody, an ancestor was psychic or intuitive, and it's passed on to the children and the parents as well?
Well, that's the whole point, is when I ask someone who's come to me, has mum or dad or granny or granddad ever been very psychic? Or, they might say, well, granddad was always interested in UFOs, or Nan was always a little bit fey, she used to see things. And sometimes they'll say, granny ended up in a mental hospital or something or other. Whether we like it or not, this is how such things were interpreted a few generations ago. You start to see more than anybody else, and that's where you go, because there's something wrong with you. All they really are is more clairvoyant, clairaudient. So it comes with that genetic line of experience, because in many cases, it's been through some interaction that they've had with these non-human intelligences. And I really want to clarify, we're not just talking about physical non-human intelligences. We're talking about interdimensionals, extradimensionals, transdimensionals, beings from our future. So there's a whole range of intelligences in different forms. And many people will want to know where angels and spirit guides and fairies fit in. It's actually all in the same bucket. It just depends on your belief system. For example, somebody very religious may say, well, I see angels. Someone non-religious will say, I see light beings. In many cases, I think they're seeing the same thing. It's just that they're interpreting it through their belief system, their religious lens.
And are there like good, bad ETs in between, or is it, there's a spectrum, right?
I can't say categorically anything other than it seems to be there are some that are self-serving, and there are some that seem to be extremely benevolent. I do think that part of the soul journey is that we've come here to live and experience a duality, which means we are experiencing love and the lack of love. And I think that's part of our soul learning to know what is not loving and what is loving as part of the journey. I try and get away from good and bad and whatever, because I think if our soul has chosen this journey, it's chosen the package of duality, which means that how do you know what joy is if you've never experienced what the lack of joy? So I think we've come to experience the lack and what it is, so that we learn. I think we've come down for a human experience, a human adventure, and we've decided to put into that adventure dramas, experiences, learning, and learning what love is and what true love is, which is without judgment and has compassion for everything. I think this is all part of the human journey.
And do your clients often sometimes have fear of extraterrestrials that don't look so humanoid, that have 4 or 5 appendages? Has there ever been like helping them to understand why they feel the way they do? If they see something different other than the human form?
I think that we are very judgmental as a human species. Let's face it, we still have parts of the world where if you're a different color or you've got your eyes are a different shape, then somebody's going to have a problem with you. Goodness knows what they're going to do when they're going to see maybe a mantis being or a reptilian or a grey or a lion being or whatever. The bottom line is we've got to learn that it's not the form, it's the sentience behind the form. I mean, I often say to people, you know, even in our human eyes, we'll look at someone who's very beautiful and we'll immediately assume that they're good. And we see somebody ugly or perhaps deformed in some way and assume that, oh, they can't be good because they look too ugly. Yet the one that looks the most ugly may be the most beautiful soul imaginable. And the person that looks beautiful could be a real rat bag. So it's about us learning to look at and sense what it is that's within that form rather than looking at the shape. And I think it's teaching us not to be discriminatory. Just because they don't look human doesn't mean they're bad. Just because they look different, it's teaching us to become more galactic and more accepting of different forms of sentience, because you know what, we may very well have been some of those particular beings that confront us now. As an 8-year-old told me that he was a mantis in his past life and he was going back to his ancestors who were the mantis. So he had absolutely no problem with looking like a praying mantis in his past life, and they were his family, they were his ancestors. So when you get this from an 8-year-old, they're teaching us something extremely valuable, I think.
Indeed. What has been some of your most beautiful experiences or most interesting ones, or do you have like one in particular that you connect to the most in life, what you've experienced or seen?
I think that there are 2 things that come to mind. One of the things that feeds my soul is meeting other awake souls and sharing with them, because one of the benefits of being a researcher and a therapist, and I know you understand this, is that you get to meet what I call the most awake and aware people on the planet. So the sharing with someone that's on the same page as you feeds my soul, and it teaches me so much. My work, you know, when I come across a new bit of information that helps me understand the mystery, I think has been, for me, one of the most wonderful things. But the other thing that surprised me and has been so useful was finally realizing that I could access so much more than I ever realized, that we're all so amazing, really. As you know, this 9-year-old said, Mary, human beings are so amazing, but they've got to believe it first. And I think that's what has been so revelatory to me, is that, you know, so many people feel bad about themselves, think everybody's better than them. If they haven't got the pieces of paper, they're not good enough, all this stuff, when in fact, all of us are amazing beings. We're all completely equal. We may all have different awareness, but we're actually all the same. The feeling of connectedness to that, and the connectedness to, we're all sharing this wonderful adventure down here, no matter what role that, I think, is what feeds me more than anything, is the blessing of being in a position to be part of that understanding, that awareness. So if I mean, I've had lots of beautiful experiences with all sorts of wonderful souls, but I think for me, just being in a position where I can be part of that, I think, is probably the bouquet, if you like.
And I've heard that you had this beautiful experience with Carlos Diaz and the lights, and what was that about? There was a cameraman, and that one to me stood out. Well,
That was, I've had lots of, that was interesting because we'd gone because we wanted to see if we could connect with Carlos Diaz, but he wasn't in Tepoztlan at the time. He was treated almost like a saint by those in, the cafes and what have you. There's pictures of the light ships and Carlos Diaz, but we went to a place very near where he was seeing the light ships one night, and it was a field that was pitch black. And there were, I think, 7 of us. I think it was 7 of us. And we were there with a cameraman as well. And we were just going to do a meditation. And we had no expectations particularly. We just wanted to see if anything may have happened. So the cameraman was there. And the 7 of us, I think it was 7. And we all held hands and we all put out a meditation for the planet and healing and all of that. And we were standing there really quietly, just meditating. And I remember getting suddenly very frustrated because I kept being aware of this bright light right in the center of the circle, even though my eyes were closed. It was annoying me. It was like, what's this light? I want to just concentrate on my meditation. And I was thinking it was the cameraman that was somehow standing in a way, shining the light of the camera. Why he would do that or why I thought, I don't know. And I kept thinking, I wish he would step away, because it's irritating, And so anyway, we had the meditation and we came out of it, and the cameraman's at the other end of the field. And he said, so we said, what are you doing over there? I thought you were filming us. And he said, you suddenly started to be surrounded by this fog. And he said, and I got really scared. And he said, and I went to the end of the field. I wasn't going to stay around. So what that said to me was something happened for sure. And it wasn't him with his camera. So something occurred, and 2 other people, not the whole 7, 2 other people heard strange sounds and also saw the light. So it wasn't just me, but the others didn't. So I suspect something went on there, and I've never really explored it other than realizing that at the time I didn't quite put 2 and 2 together and make 4. I was just still, hold on a minute, what actually happened here? And I still don't really know, other than I think it was some form of communication.
So the attunement with the meditation was there for them to do something.
And it's interesting, there's only 3 of us, me and 2 others, that saw the light. The rest didn't.
Mm-hmm.
I did have another interesting experience when I was with the group doing crop circles and contact in Western Australia. And we were in a place called Bunbury. And the night before, most of them had seen this strange light, which we thought was a UFO outside. I didn't, but some of the other of the crew did. And that night, we all went to bed at different times. And I went to bed relatively early. And I think I had left 2 other people that hadn't gone to bed. And I'm just about to fall asleep. And I hear this banging of the door and thinking, oh, someone's gone outside and they've left the door to bang, without realizing it was actually a folding door, one of these sliding doors, and sliding doors don't bang. Huge banging, people will relate to this. And then this scraping across the floor, like somebody was pulling something really heavy across the floor. And I'm thinking, is that my friend so-and-so moving something? I wish you'd be quiet. Because it woke me up again. I was just about to fall asleep and it would wake me up. And I'm thinking, I wish you'd just go to bed. I was getting really irritated again, This happened 2 or 3 times where I'd just about be falling asleep, and then the scraping would happen all over again. The next morning, I get up and I'm talking to one of my friends and I'm saying, was it so-and-so doing that last night? Was she getting something out there, And she said, yes, I heard something too. I heard that, and she'd heard identical to me, but she'd also thought that somebody had come in and was chatting to somebody. When we both thought it was the same person, when she came out of her bedroom, we said, what were you doing last night? She said, what do you mean? I went to bed straight after you. There was nothing, but we both heard it. So the banging of the door, which couldn't bang because it was a sliding door. Heavy furniture, it was wicker furniture. It wasn't like, it felt like somebody was pulling a washing machine across the floor. It was so loud. Something happened. Still don't know what that was, but it certainly wasn't what we thought it was. We were blaming this lovely soul, and it was nothing to do with her because she'd gone to bed too. So there's things like that happen, and you often wonder what actually is going on there. And I suspect we had visitors, and they're tangible things, because people say to me, you know, sometimes it's hard to know what's really going on, or they don't even want to acknowledge it. There'll be people see UFOs and they don't want to talk about it. No, don't want to know, don't want to know, don't want to know. And we live in a world where a lot of the time we dismiss things if we can't understand them. Whereas if you look into them, they're, you know, they're highly anomalous in terms of our reality. But that was another one where I think we had a visit, but I'm not really sure what that was.
Could they have been cloaked and invisible and just walking around and moving things?
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of those that have had encounters have talked about the banging on the front door, you know, the noise, and that was what's so weird, because it literally felt like somebody was banging the door like that when there was no door to bang, because it was glass and it was, you know, it was a sliding door, so there was no way you could do that. But the noising was really loud, the other side of the door, literally like someone was pulling a washing machine or something like that. What that was about, why they needed to make that noise, whoever these intelligences were, maybe they were just letting us know that it was real. And sometimes I think that's what they do it for, is to say, you know, you think this isn't real, well, let's show you how real it is. Whether or not we were in fact picked up, and that's possible. Each time when I heard it, I was just, you know, when you're just about to fall asleep and it makes you jump because you're just about maybe to go out of body. And each time that happened. So something could very well have occurred, because the one thing that brings me to is what people don't realize is when you're having an encounter, our surveys have shown that only 25% of it is physical and 75% is you're taken out of body. And that's a new fact that we've come across in the survey. And part of the reason I think nuts and bolts ufologists struggle, because again, how do you quantify out-of-body experiences against a physical experience? They're both as valid, but much harder to quantify.
And can it be sometimes telepathic, where they're talking to you in your brain and you're hearing, it's in English, but it's obviously not a human intelligence, it's extraterrestrial?
Absolutely. Communication that comes in, many experience downloads of information that just appear, and they'll say, I wasn't even thinking about anything, but this information, I had to write it down. It's not like automatic writing. It's just the information's there and people just write it down. The others can be a communication. I call that the telephone link, where you ask the question, you get the answer, or you're looking at something and all of a sudden information will come in about that, for example. It's quite normal. I mean, this is not an aberration. This is you being assisted by an intelligence that's wanting you to know something. Some call them spirit guides. Some call them my angels. Some will say, you know, it's a blue being, or it's my light being, or it's my angelic being. It doesn't really matter, as long as the information is useful, helpful, positive, supportive. All those things tell you the frequency of the intelligence that's working with you. When I say to people, it's very clear, you know, they say, well, how do I know the good ones from the bad ones, or all the rest of it? And I'm saying it's actually quite clear. I said, why do you have certain special friends, certain people in your life that are close to you? What is it about them that you love, that you always share and whatever? And they're saying, because they're loving, compassionate, they help me, they don't tell me what to do, they don't use fear to control me. I said, well, it's exactly the same with these lot. It's no different to that. If you follow the same rules for your non-human support team, I said, you're not going to go far wrong, because the ones that start to tell you what to do or use fear to control you are not those that you want to interact with. And you basically say, no, thanks very much, you know, because it's, to me, that's how it works. It's really not rocket science.
Yeah, it's the free will to either experience it or say, no, please leave. I don't want to deal with you.
Yeah, it's exactly the same. And a lot of people think because it's non-physical that the rules should be different. I said, not at all. It's exactly the same rules. I said, you know what's loving, you know what's supportive, you know what isn't. And I said, and that rule goes for your spiritual life as well as your physical life.
Beautiful. Can you tell us how people can contact you for services, for interviews?
Well, it's pretty easy. If you Google me, you'll find that I've got a website, which is maryrodwell.com.au or acern.com.au. I've got a Facebook, I'm on Facebook. As I say, you can see a lot of my presentations, YouTube presentations on the internet as well. So there's a lot of different ways and very, very easy to get in touch with. So if you can't find my websites, just go on Facebook and send me a message.
Okay, wonderful. And you've written so many beautiful books. What's the latest one that's been published?
Well, the latest one is called The New Human: Awakening to Our Cosmic Heritage. And the reason I wrote that was because I wanted to show what the children remember consciously as being really important. If you've got children that are coming out with extraordinary things or extraordinary abilities, what do you do? How do you help them? How do you understand them? How can you support them? But also the teenagers that have lots of conscious memory as well. And a lot of the teenagers are struggling about being different. So how do you help them as well? And then there's the adults that are the ones that are creating artwork, coming out with different frequencies. And one of them is a medical doctor who had a shift in consciousness in India and now calls herself a shamanic medical doctor because she activates DNA. So she stepped right out of the box and said, this is now my role. I also have a God chapter, which I call the God chapter, which is two religious ministers, Christian ministers, that found that they were having ET experiences. How do they actually put that into their belief system, and how do they manage that, for example? So there's a whole range of ways, depending on your perspective, on how you interpret what's going on for you and what's useful to you, what helps you expand and what have you. So the New Human is really about us. But it's also, for many people, it'll help them validate their own experiences that perhaps they've never talked about before, and that's what it's for.
And you're also going to Contact in the Desert next, right? That conference.
Yes, yeah, that's the end of May, and I'll be showing more about contact. And there's a gentleman that's had contact with a ball of light, but also hybrids. You know, the New Human, the children, and the hybrids, and the ones in families that are now connecting to that term, hybrids as well. But also I'm going to do a workshop in how to open up your multi-dimensional self and how easy it is and how to understand it.
So anybody who's interested, please contact Mary and go see her next conference at Contact in the Desert. Thank you so much, Mary, for coming on and sharing your beautiful experiences and knowledge. I appreciate it.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for asking me.